Hello everyone. Before starting the video, subscribe to the channel because there are many different scary adventures. Craigslist is an online platform that allows users to list items for sale, provide services, search for jobs, and find roommates in rental housing. However, in this story, I want to talk about how Craigslist became a place where people began to disappear. In the early 2000s, there were mass disappearances of young women in America. They were often the last to be recorded on the Craigslist before disappearing. The police could not find the reason for their disappearance for a long time, but it soon became clear that they were all connected with the same person, a serial killer who used Craigslist to search for his victims. The killer, whose name was Richard Blakely, infiltrated the site and posted fake job ads, which then attracted young women. He then invited them to a meeting, and when they came to his address, he killed them. Blakely continued his cruel deeds for several years, and many of his victims were only found after he was arrested. But the story doesn't end here. A few years later, after Blakely was sentenced to life in prison, new ads began to appear on Craigslist that linked to other missing people. Some of them were children, others were young men and women. It soon became apparent that someone was using Craigslist to find their victims. Unlike Blakely, the new killer was more careful and selective. He left no trace on the site, and it was very difficult to determine which ads were related to his activities. The police launched an investigation, but they did not have any evidence or specific suspects. Craigslist users 100 began to be afraid. They realized that their own ads could get the killer's attention, and many of them stopped using the site. Some even approached the Craigslist administration, demanding that steps be taken to protect users. But despite all these precautions, the killer continued his activities. People from all over the country became his victims, and the police could not find any connections between them. He used various names and email addresses, and it was very difficult to trace his trail. Eventually, the police were able to track down the killer thanks to eyewitness accounts and the detailed work of Craigslist's security team. They discovered that the killer, whose name was David King, had been using the site to find his victims for several years. He created fake ads and attracted people to his meetings where he killed them. King was arrested and found guilty of several murders. His case became widely discussed in the media, and many people began to be afraid to use Craigslist. The site administration was forced to take measures to ensure the safety of users, including changes in the registration process and the search for ads. Today, Craigslist is still one of the most popular sites in the US, but the story of the killers of Richard Blakely and David King reminds us that even the virtual world can be a dangerous place. Users must be careful and take precautions to protect themselves from potential threats. A hot summer day in California quickly turned into a cool evening, and a young girl named Lisa decided to spend it, as usual, watching TV shows. She did not know that this evening would be the most terrible in her life. Suddenly, an advertisement for the Craigslist website appeared on the screen, which she had known for a long time and had repeatedly used its services before. She started leafing through ads, and she came across a very interesting offer: work in the office. The prospect of making good money without leaving the city could not fail to attract her attention. Lisa decided to contact the employer, and he answered her pretty quickly. He suggested that she meet the next day to discuss the details of the job. Lisa left her phone number and email address, and they agreed to meet. The next day, Lisa came to the meeting and found that the employer, a middle-aged man, was rather shabbily dressed and behaved very strangely. He asked strange questions that were not related to work and looked at Lisa very suspiciously. But, despite this, Lisa did not give up and continued the conversation. However, she suddenly felt very ill. She began to feel dizzy and then lost consciousness. When Lisa came to, she found herself in the basement, bound and handcuffed. The employer was nearby, looked at her and smiled. He began to say that he was a serial killer who had already killed several women found on Craigslist, and that Lisa was his latest victim. Lisa was horrified and understood that her life depended on what happened next. She tried to convince the killer that she didn't deserve such a fate, but that didn't help. The employer began torturing her and Liz. But suddenly, from afar, the sounds of a police car siren were heard. The employer began to panic and tried to run away, but the police managed to detain him. Lisa was saved. It was later revealed that this man was indeed a serial killer, and Lisa was the last victim on his list. He used Craigslist to find his victims. Lisa was able to survive and tell her story, helping the police catch the killer. From that day on, Lisa never used Craigslist again. She understood that making good money was not worth the risk of her life. She told her story to all her acquaintances so that they be careful when using internet resources. It was in the summer of 2017 in one of the suburbs of Los Angeles. A young guy named Jake decided to find a new home on Craigslist. He looked through many ads until he came across one that looked very attractive. The ad said that the owner was renting out part of his home for a very reasonable price. The description seemed perfect. New furniture, fresh renovation, quiet area, and close to Jake's work. The ad included a phone number and an address where the owner could be contacted. Jake, without hesitation, called the specified number. He was greeted warmly by a woman named Mary, who said that she and her husband had decided to rent out a small part of their house as they were going to be away for a few months in another state. Mary told Jake more about her offer, and he decided to book a room. A few days later, Jake arrived at the address on the ad to see the room. He was met by Mary, who showed him around the house and showed him the room he was going to rent. The room was even better than in the photos. Bright, spacious, and clean. Jake was delighted and did not think long. He immediately signed the contract and transferred the first payment. Mary gave him the keys and told him that the neighbors were very friendly, but it was better that he didn't tell them that he was renting a room through Craigslist. Jake agreed and promised that he would not tell anyone about this. From the first days, Jake liked living in a new place. His neighbors were very friendly and attentive. He felt at home. However, after a few weeks, strange things began to happen. At night he heard rustling behind the wall, as if someone was wandering around the house. Every time he left the room, he noticed that someone was closing the bathroom door. But the worst was the incident that happened at night a few days later. Jake was awakened by a sound that came from downstairs. He left the room to check what was going on. When he went down to the first floor, he saw that the door leading to the basement was open. But the most terrible thing was that a faint light came from under the door, which shone on the stairs. Jake stood still, not knowing what to do. His heart began to beat faster, and thoughts swirled in his head about what might be in the basement. He gathered all his strength and went to the door. He cautiously looked inside and saw a man sitting on the floor with his eyes closed. Jake was frightened, but he knew immediately that this was Marin's husband. He asked what happened, and Mary's husband told him that he was meditating. He explained that there was a meditation room in the basement and that he sometimes spent several hours a day there. Jake felt better, but he was still scared. He couldn't understand why Mary and her husband didn't tell him about the meditation room when he rented the room. He felt cheated and decided to move to another place. A few days later, when Jake was already at his new place of residence, he received a message from Mary. In the message, she apologized and said that they didn't want to scare him, so they didn't talk about the meditation room. She also said that they had hired a new tenant and that he didn't have to worry. Jake was grateful for the apology, but he still felt uncomfortable. He realized that he needed to be careful when choosing housing in order to avoid similar situations in the future. He also realized the importance of communicating openly with neighbors and landlords to avoid misunderstandings and distrust. Overall, Jake's story is a reminder that communication is a key element in any relationship, including rentals. It is important to be open and honest with neighbors and landlords in order to avoid misunderstandings and conflicts. It is also worth carefully studying the terms of the lease and asking questions to avoid unpleasant surprises. On Craigslist, I found an ad for a house. I have been looking for the perfect place to live with my family for a long time, and this house seemed like the dream I was looking for. I contacted the seller, and we made an appointment to see the house. When I arrived, I was greeted by a woman who introduced herself as Rachel. She took me around the house and told me about its history. I was fascinated by her story, and soon we began to discuss the terms of the sale. All of a sudden, Rachel offered me a low price that seemed too good to be true. I began to suspect that something was wrong and started asking her questions. She became nervous and ended up telling me a terrible story. She said that her husband, the former owner of the house, was a psychopath and a murderer. He used Craigslist to attract his victims, whom he then killed in the basement of this house. Rachel managed to escape from him and hide, but she always remained under his close supervision. She told me that her husband is in prison, but she still fears for her life because she does not know who could be involved in his activities. She asked me to help her sell her house and leave the city to start a new life in safety. I was shocked by her story and decided to help her. We made a deal and I bought the house, but I could never forget what happened in his basement. I started to get a security system and was always on my guard when I was at home. But despite all my precautions, I could never leave the feeling that I was not alone in this house. It seemed that someone was always watching me, and I began to experience an unhealthy paranoia. I even started to avoid the house, so as not to feel this vague threat. One evening when I returned home, I noticed that my things had been turned over and moved, and that the things I thought I had put in one place were now in another. I started to panic and tried to call the police, but my phone was not working. I felt that someone was here, but I could not determine who. Suddenly I heard footsteps on the stairs, and my heart sank into my heels. I was sure it was Rachel and that she had returned to make sure I hadn't discovered her secret. But when I climbed the stairs, I saw an unfamiliar man who was standing in the center of the corridor. My first instinct was to attack him, but I noticed that he had a note in his hands. He told me that he worked for Rachel and that she was concerned that someone might find out about what was going on in this house. He gave me a note that warned me not to go outside for a few days because she had police contacts and she could pick me up as a suspect. I was shocked and scared, but I was grateful for the warning and decided to follow his advice. I stayed in the house for several days, trying to avoid any contact with the world. But I still felt like someone was watching me. When I finally left the house, I saw that my car had been wrecked and burned, and that there were threats and messages written on the walls indicating that Rachel and her husband were even more dangerous than I thought. I never returned to this house and never even sold it. I just left him and tried to forget about everything. But this house will always remind me of what can hide behind closed doors and that you can never be too sure who is a true friend and who is not. It is advisable to always be cautious and prudent, especially in dealing with people whom we do not know well enough. And if you have suspicions or a feeling that something is wrong, then it is better to seek the help of professionals than to risk your safety. One day, a girl named Kate decided to sell her old furniture on Craigslist. She posted an ad and quickly received several calls from potential buyers. But one call was particularly odd. The voice that called her back was hoarse and mysterious. Despite this, Kate decided to continue the conversation. as she was sure that this was just business. The buyer informed her that he was interested in her furniture and offered to buy it for a surprisingly high price. Kate was happy and agreed to the deal, but she could not imagine what horrors lay ahead of her. On the day of the meeting, Kate went to the specified address, but noticed that it was an old abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. She froze with fear when she heard the door lock shut behind her. Kate tried to get out of the house, but she was trapped inside. Suddenly, a masked man entered the room and quickly closed the door. Kate tried to get out of the room in horror, but the door was impenetrable. The man started talking to her, explaining that he was the killer and that she was his next victim. Kate began to scream and ask for help, but no one came to help. The man told her that he had been following her for a long time and that he wanted to kill her. He went on to say that he was avoiding arrest because he worked for the police. Kate was convinced that this was the end for her. However, suddenly the door of the room opened and another man entered, this time in a police uniform. He was a police officer and informed Kate that they had been following the killer for a long time. The police rescued her at the last moment. Kate survived, but she was left badly injured. She never used Craigslist to sell her stuff again and was always careful when meeting strangers. This horrific experience made her value life and safety even more.